My topic about this couldn't have come at a better time, right after Shindonyuk and Yeonmi Park, talking about migration, liberty, and prosperity. I mean, what better examples of the importance of liberty than the stories that they've told? You know, a lot of times people have been saying, well, Ken, you've given that talk about migration before. Okay, couldn't you come up with something different? Well, in a sense, it's my passion. And yes, I could come up with something else, but this is where my passion is, and I can tell the story in a multitude of different ways, and sometimes weaving in things that some of you may have heard before. But please forgive me, because people throughout history, prehistory, through human existence, have been moving around the planet. It's part of our DNA, you might say, as Shindon Hyuk said today. Yes, it is our part, because it is all of our nature to leave behind starvation, drought, death, and disease, and tyranny, and to move to places that offer a greater opportunity for ourselves and our families to live a better life and a freer life for our children. I think it's very important. It's all of our ancestors have done this. None of us live where our distant ancestors lived before. We're all living in a different place because of it. It's part of our nature. And yet, just last week, I've noticed in the New York International Times, the international version of the New York Times, they said 60 million people are displaced around the world. Now, this is more than a number. It's extraordinary hardship and suffering and death that's accompanying this. Millions from Colombia, millions from Syria, millions from various places around the world. And we see the maps, and we see the stories probably more current in today's newspapers than we have in a long time. But that's only because, yes, it is visible, and it is happening in great numbers. We find the people coming across coming across the Mediterranean. And the big issue for the Europeans isn't, well, how do we embrace them? How do we welcome them? No, the question is, how do we control this? What do we do with those traffickers? Now, they're informal travel agents, indeed, and a lot of times their motives and interests aren't all that great, but they're serving a service that is extremely important to those people desperate enough to leave behind everything that's familiar to them, paying over fortunes to themselves, where we might fly around the world for $500 or $100 or $1,000. They have to pay a lifetime of fortune, not only for themselves, but for their families and friends who have contributed to their cause, to put together $50,000 or $5,000 just to get to a place where they offer hope for the rest of their family or for the rest of their village. We have friends from China who are living in Hawaii now, but they took an incredible journey. It cost $50,000 for my good friend to go to Ecuador and then all the way up the coast to the United States. And then there are those who do come to the United States, as Wen did, from Ecuador and South America here to go up in here. But there are people who come from all over the world. They go across deserts, they go through jungles, they go across shark-infested seas that are stormy and have pirates, and maybe a third of them perish on the way. But they're willing to take these risks, and I admire them. I mean, what amazing courage to do this sort of thing. I wish that I had such courage. I wonder, if I was in their shoes, would I have the courage to do these things to make a better living for myself and for my family? You know, I don't make a distinction between political refugees and economic refugees. All are political refugees because they're fleeing political systems that are very, very hard to live with. I have there's a guy, when I was in Arizona, there was a guy here, Walt Staten, who was arrested because he planted bottles of water along the passageways where people were dying out in the deserts. And he was arrested and convicted for the crime of littering. He was convicted to 300 hours of community service. And he said, I thought that's what I was doing. Now here, we're close in Asia. We see a lot of things happening here, especially this summer with the Rohingya, who have been treated, I'd say, quite badly, brutally in parts of of Burma. They're denied citizenship rights, and they're treated badly because of religion or because of their ethnic background. And they're trying to flee. And they flee in the only way that they can by paying people who are willing to take them on these rickety boats for extortionate amounts, and they often rob them on the way, and they leave them in prisons on the way. And then the answer has been initially to just, arrest the traffickers so the traffickers leave them adrift at sea. Well, this is quite tragic. Even the Australians have said, well, we're going to pay the traffickers to take them somewhere else. Today, we saw a happy ending for one of the two stories here this week of Shin Dong-yuk, whom I met first at Lausanne, where he gave the talk 2 years ago at the ISIL conference, and Yeonmi Park. They were one of the ones that were lucky enough to be able to escape. How many thousands of cases just like them perished because they weren't so lucky to escape? But they did, and they had to do tremendously arduous journeys. Most of the escapees from North Korea have to go through hostile territory where China doesn't want them. As a matter of fact, most of the world doesn't want them. If most of the world embraced them, my guess is that China might have a different attitude toward them if it was a lot easier for them to find homes. But it's even difficult for a lot of the people to settle unimpeded in South Korea. It reminds me, as it did Shin Dong-yuk when he made his comment about how this went on in our history, and we noticed it after the war. But people knew at the time what was happening to the Jews and the Poles and the Catholics in Europe. This famous case of Anne Frank, what is not well known about her case, before she and her family and so many millions of others of Jews and the others who died in Europe, what is not so well known is that twice her father applied for a visa to the United States and was turned down because the quota was full. Because in the last 150 years, people were treated as products. We've got quotas on automobiles, we have quotas on people that limit the number that are allowed to leave, no matter what the condition was. Well, I say to this question, maybe if this is the tyrant, and this is the person who's trying to escape, and there's a guard on this side of the border that turns them away, it doesn't really matter on which side of the border the guard is. The effect is the same. Whether this tyrant keeps them in, or this tyrant refuses them exit and returns them, the effect is the same. And so I would say yes to this question here, that C is also responsible for what happened to B when they're turned away and when they die or they perish or they suffer. We have a lot of people who, at the same time that the officials were playing with people as if they were pawns and saying, no, the quota is full, these people were heroes. Many of you have heard of Schindler, Oskar Schindler, because of the movie of Schindler's List. But there were others, Chiyune Nahara and Dr. Hui, who signed papers for thousands to escape from Germany, and they did find refuge. But there's that kind of opportunity for all of us. Casey will be able to put you in touch with people who can offer an opportunity for you to pay for those who are operating the Underground Railroad from North Korea to help people escape. I think it's something like, it costs about $1,000 per escapee. There were walls that were up, and we're glad to see them down. And the greatest effect of this was not only freedom for those people who were allowed to escape the Iron Curtain, and the people who were benefiting by the productivity of welcoming them, but also it meant the collapse of the tyrants behind the walls, because they can't keep controlling people if they're all leaving. They've got to have people to control, and they have to behave better in order to keep people as long as they can escape. That was true of the slaves in the Old South, and it's true of throughout history. Tyrants have to behave better when people can leave. But if they can't leave, and everybody around the world collaborates with pushing them back, they can behave pretty much as badly as they want. The fears are what keep people out. Now, courage embraces the newcomer. Fear rejects the newcomer. Courage welcomes competition. Fear Fears competition. I have a German student this year. He says, you know, we have a saying in Germany, if you feel that a foreigner is coming and stealing your job, the problem isn't with the foreigner. The problem is with you. You can't find something else to do. You've been raised in one of the most prosperous countries in the world, and you fear the people who are desperately poor and have almost nothing. And fear rejects liberty. Courage champions liberty. The one reason that people fear a lot is because they don't like what they see. When they see a mass of people together, they're different. They're a mass of people. It's chaotic. We don't know what to make of it. What we don't see are all the things that they can become. Because given time, immigrants are the most industrious. I mean, I ask my students, who is more likely to be the harder worker? Somebody who was born in your neighborhood, or somebody who was born far away and had to come long distances and undertake great travails in order to find a place? They almost always say, well, the person who had to travel all those distances was the harder worker, the more industrious. And I include in this my wife and my great-grandfather, who traveled to America and are very much more, were much more productive as a result. All too often the world has viewed oil as more valuable than people. What nation in the world rejects oil? Oh yeah, give us your oil, we'll go fight for it. We'll do anything we can get oil, barrels of oil are so great. And yet almost everybody in the world rejects people. Well, I can understand in this case, but nothing personal, brother. But people have arms, legs, brains. Now, suppose that you had a barrel of oil that could reproduce itself. My gosh, what a fantastic... This would be a miracle of the century. Everybody would love that. We have people who can reproduce themselves, and that's considered a calamity. Oh no, overpopulation, there's no room for everybody. That's... In every country, there are people who I consider the excluders. They don't want immigrants. Okay, I can live with that. That's their personal decision on their own private property. And there are people who I consider the inviters. They want to hire people. They want to invite them to be entrepreneurs, to be hired by them. They want to sell products to them. It's the same with products. These people don't want to buy foreign products. These people do want to buy foreign products and foreign labor. Now, the problem seems to be this area in between, the government property, which a libertarian might say, well, auction it off or privatize it or homestead it so that it becomes private property for someone. In lieu of that, we find a lot of people saying, well, no, it has to be treated as if it's the domain of the excluders. All the property, all the goods, all the people have to be allowed only in if these people agree and want them to. So these people are denied their own life, liberty, and property to invite them to benefit by commerce with them. No, I prefer the other way around. Why shouldn't the government property be treating people, allowing the inviters to invite people to their property and invite the excluders to go ahead and exclude people if they want? And this was the policy in America for most of its history. Everybody was welcome. In fact, companies went out around the world offering contracts for labor by the thousands from Asia, from Europe, to come to America and work in the factories, work on the plantations, work on the railroads. They built America. In fact, they say that America is a nation of immigrants because almost all the people, now the Indians didn't much appreciate all of this because they were treated badly by some of the people who came from Europe especially, but mostly Europeans wanted more people to come. Throughout that period of time, it was even the founding fathers in the United States who set out as one of the top reasons in their Declaration of Independence from England is that King George III is trying to restrict people coming into the country. We want them. It's wealth, it's prosperity, it's our future. Now, there is a economic freedom of the world index that's produced by the Fraser Institute that talks about all the different criteria that lead to economic growth and prosperity. The size of government spending and taxation, legal and property rights, sound money, free trade, regulation, light regulation. And they rank the countries of the world, and the countries up at the top, always Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand, and the countries at the bottom, almost always Venezuela, Myanmar. North Korea is not even on the list because it's so far off the bottom. But when you look at their results, they find that the countries at the top of the list have the most wealth, and they're growing the most. Now, this isn't the ethical argument, this is the practical argument you can make. Well, people that are most free can produce more. They have the greater incentive and reward to do so. The examples I find are in history. For example, all of these countries in 1950 they were wealthier than these countries, these tigers of Asia. And yet, in 50 years, being low on the list, they produced some improvement. Well, not much in Venezuela, but some improvement. Whereas these tigers became from the poorest in the world to the richest in the world with economic freedom. 20, 30, and 40 times as much wealth per person as they had before. Now, China has been growing a lot. They lifted more people out of poverty in the last 20 years than any other example in history. Maybe 300 to 500 million people lifted out of poverty by exercising openness to markets and economic activity, economic freedom. Now, China is low on the list, but people say, well, you see, it's proof that it doesn't work. But I say, no, it's proof that it does work. Because the freest zones are freer than Hong Kong and Singapore for economic freedom, according to the Fraser Institute's analysis of the provinces of China. And other zones, the ones that are not growing, are the lowest economic freedom. And the people are finding that these are the engines of economic growth for China, the ones at the top. And the people are moving by the millions from these regions to these regions. And that's why it causes me to say that a sixth criteria that should be in the Economic Freedom Report of the World Report should be migration. As a matter of fact, it shouldn't just be the sixth item, it should be the first item. According to the work by Ortega and Perry, they say openness to knowledge, skills, and ideas from the rest of the world may be one of the most important engines of economic growth and technological advancement for a country. We show that openness to immigration is a strong predictor of its income per person and works much better for immigration than for trade. In other words, if you really, really want to show economic growth, don't just measure trade, the movement of products across borders, or the movement of money across borders. Look at the movement of people across borders, because that's also been the story in China. China has seen people move from all across the poor and desperate regions of economic control to the free economic zones along the coast where they've been trying to imitate what Hong Kong did. And they brought astounding success, just as Hong Kong, being most open in the world to migration from 1950s on for a long part of its growth history, it grew astoundingly greatly due to the openness to people coming from abroad. Not just products, but people. And Shenzhen, from a sleepy fishing village to the city that it is to for the same reason. Now that's internal migration. What about across borders? Now the Reason magazine just this month published a nice little study that says a worker in Somalia can produce only 1/10 of the economic value of a worker in the United States. But as soon as that she trades the hellhole of Mogadishu for the comparative paradise of Minneapolis, she can immediately produce vastly more. Multiply that by hundreds of millions still stuck in low productivity countries, and you can double the world's wealth. In fact, I would guess it would be more than doubling the world's wealth. So, this happens to be my wife. She moved from China to the United States, and I would say she's much more productive now cooking for me and producing these. She loves to cook, okay, but operating that tractor out in the fields of China was not the best of use of her talents. And so at the University of Wisconsin, economist John Kennan says, if all workers of the world were allowed to move to places with higher total factor productivity, it would produce the equivalent of doubling the world's supply of laborers without increasing the number of people. Well, that's pretty good, just by making them more productive. Are they more productive? Adrian Furman says the first generation migrants start businesses at twice the rate of Native Americans and even of second generation foreigners. He says half of the world's skilled migrants go to America and in 20 years created 25% of all American venture-backed capital. Why? The sort of people who migrate, they have a different pattern of motivation, abilities, and adjustment. They are hungrier, more risk-taking, and more hardy. And they deserve those jobs. If they can do my job better than I can, they deserve to have my job. And I should be motivated to find a better job. I don't deserve my job because I happen to have been born in a particular place. My wife, when she moved from China to the United States, she was still the same person. She didn't suddenly get a glow about her because she had citizenship. She always had a glow about her. Stuart Anderson, working with the Cato Institute and executive director of the National Foundation of American Policy, says the immigrant entrepreneurs are the heroes of a market-based economy driving innovation and job creation. They started 33% of U.S. venture-backed public companies from 2006 to 2012. A lot of names that we're very familiar with. We all depend on it, and we forget the fact that they are the ones who moved. If they weren't allowed to move to the United States or wherever they're going from a place where they were unproductive to a place where they were more productive, we would never have known about it. What are we missing out by pushing millions of desperate refugees back away? We are the ones who are losing out from all of their productivity and genius. A lot of people say, well, welfare is the magnet. It brings people to America only because of the welfare system. And Europeans say the same stuff. It's just an excuse. Their real reason is racial fear, religious fear, all kinds of intolerance, but they use this as the justification. They've established one kind of tyranny on people. We're going to have the welfare state, and they use that as a contingent liberty. You can't have freedom of movement as long as the government's running the welfare state. Well, I've demonstrated this is absolutely false. Because if immigrants really were coming for the welfare, in the United States there's 50 different welfare systems. They could rush instead to the states that pay the most welfare, like Hawaii, way at the top of the list, where I come from. But the proof of it is that they are leaving all the states with the highest amount of welfare. Their movement, both the native population and the immigrant population, is away from those to the bottom, to the states with the least amount of welfare. Why? Because they're looking for jobs and opportunities, and that comes with low taxes, not with high taxes to support the welfare state. And this brings on a different kind of voluntary charity. All those workers who've been coming in enormous numbers, as they're allowed in, send home a lot more money. And it's much, much more productive as remittances going to families and people that they know, and they know is benefiting, than the welfare that's offered by overseas development assistance, the welfare of foreign aid. As a matter of fact, this is so astounding that it is exceeding the amount of money that is going to remittances is far in excess of overseas development assistance and foreign aid. And it's far more productive because it goes from people who value, the people who value, they both, they're giving to family members. They know that it's going to be well spent. Whereas government money is money that's taken from people against their will, by people, government officials who are quite wealthy, giving it to their friends in power, and it doesn't get to the people who really need it. So I would say that remittances are probably the most effective way of assisting other countries. You don't have to tax people in the United States to do that. Now, to go back to this point here, I want to say that this is an astounding thing, because like for middle-income countries, it's 3 times as much as all overseas development assistance. Now I want to get my, for low-income countries, this assistance, even though it seems like a small amount on this chart here, it is fully 8% of the GDP of low-income countries. 8% of the GDP, and I heard from Rofi's talk here yesterday, which was outstanding, that he was saying that overseas remittances back to Indonesia have reduced the poverty in the country by 26%. That's fantastic. And that means that these people aren't just working to sit back and take advantage of the welfare system. They're coming to work because they want to make a better life for themselves and to help their families back home. And for all those who are championing the poor, that should be the greatest thing to champion. A lot of people say, well, there's no space. That's the biggest lie. People don't, the history of human beings has been to move to crowded cities, and it still goes on. Now, for the most part, throughout history, and there are exceptions where people, Henry David Thoreau wanted to go out to Walden Pond, okay? And he wanted to be alone as far away from people as possible. But most people like the crowds of cities. Why? Because that's where the opportunity is. That's where the exchange, the networking, the contacts, the opportunities for family and friends, it has always been and continues to be a more prosperous life for people in the cities than in the countryside. So people, like even in New York and California, the states have lower population in New York and California. But the cities of New York City and Los Angeles have greater population. So when people have a choice, they move to crowds. And even in the United States, there's vast amounts of land. 3% of all the U.S. land is zoned for cities and suburbs. Now that means 97% is vast, well, you could say, opportunities for cities. Like when they opened up freedom just to gamble in the deserts of Nevada, they got this, a huge and thriving city of Las Vegas that produces vast amounts of jobs. Now, you may not like, my wife doesn't like Las Vegas. It's the adult Disneyland and that sort of thing. But a lot of people do. It's the number one destination for people traveling from Hawaii to the mainland is to go to Las Vegas. My friend in Canada says, if we took the population density of Hong Kong and placed it around in all the vast areas of Canada, for example, he was saying, Drew Suter was saying, well, you could take just Queen Charlotte Island. The land area could accommodate 9 Hong Kongs. The current population is 5,000. But 9 Hong Kongs is the space there. Now remember, in Hong Kong, it is the most densely populated country in the world, but still 40% of the land area is zoned country park where people aren't allowed because the government is trying to keep property prices high. But I mean, the same kind of thing if it was practically Vancouver Island could have 28 Hong Kongs. Or you go to Alberta, where my friend Drew Suter lives. He says, well, you could have 580 Hong Kongs there. And you could probably persuade the people that it might be worthwhile if you paid them $1 million each to accept newcomers. Now, this is okay. This is saying what can be done with space. Space is not the problem. People are the problem. We keep viewing products as more important than people. Oil, for example, is everyone's dream, and so the oil sands of Alberta are attracting a lot of attention, a lot of money and investment. They say that in Alberta, the current land value is about $40 billion, and the estimated oil value could be $14 trillion just by these parts of Alberta, the oil sands. Well, then he did a simple calculation. He said, what if we did the same thing and applied it to people? Allowed the people to come, just Hong Kongs in this area. That could accommodate 180 million people with an estimated economic output of 5 trillion per year and with an estimated land value of 30 trillion. Now, it seems to me a lot better as a solution than just pushing people out to sea. Oh, they're out of sight, out of mind. It doesn't matter if they die. It does matter if they die because we're part of this world too. As Shin Dong-yuk says, it can happen to any one of us. One of the great things about that movie Independence Day, you know, when the freeze came down to America, I'm not saying that this is going to happen. Leon, don't get me wrong. But the people were moving in the other direction. Americans were trying to get across the border into Mexico. Actually, the first illegal immigrants into Texas were the Americans who were coming into Mexican territory. And the Mexicans said, well, wait a minute, we don't want you to come. You're bringing slaves. Well, ultimately, I say migration, openness to migration, much as it was 150 years ago when American companies could roam the world offering contracts to laborers to come and work factories and fields and so on. We wouldn't find companies moving abroad. We'd find companies moving back because we'd have all the abundance of labor. We'd have the riches of arms, legs, and brains of some of the most industrious people in the world. It is practical, I believe. I believe it is humanitarian, much better than just letting people die. And ultimately, it is ethical, because it is treating other people as I would want them to treat me if I was in their shoes. Thank you very much. Never a shortage of questions on this topic.
Thank you very much. Very good presentation again. My topic also related to the migrant workers, but I have a different question. I mean, of course we have a desire. We want to have a freer border, but how to make that, how to make a world like that? I mean, is it necessary to eliminate the nation state system as our world system to our purpose to make a freer border? Because the border system comes from the nation state system. So is it necessary to eliminate the nation system to have a freer border? Thank you.
That's a very good point. A lot of times people assume that within the national border that you have a citizenship right which gives you a distinction of rights that are different from all others. For that I go back to the Founding Fathers, the opening document in the United States, Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so I would say that citizenship is not a privilege to some that is denied to others just simply because it distinguishes one human being from another. I consider all human beings have these same rights. Now, it certainly changes the nature and and how we view the nation state. I don't mind a nation state to prevent an invading army that wants to kill and destroy. But I think that people, I accept the idea of freedom of trade in products, just as I accept the freedom of trade in labor, that people should be allowed to move from one place to another. Now there may be problems that you might be able to identify. For example, terrorism is a big concern. A lot of people have. They say, well, how are we going to prevent terrorists? Well, no country in the world turns down tourists. Well, sometimes they give them some restrictions, but they're glad to welcome tourists and tourism and business travelers and students. And all of the 9/11 terrorists that went to the United States went on student visas. In fact, 2 of them got a renewal of their student visa a couple months after the attack on the World Trade Center. I mean, that system is not a perfect system. The biggest terrorist attack in America was Timothy McVeigh, who was a guy from New York who came to Oklahoma City, and he blew up a building that killed more people per terrorist. I mean, he by himself killed up a lot of people, and per person he killed more than even the 9/11 terrorists in the United States. But it wouldn't make sense to put up a barrier around New York and say, well, he came from New York, therefore as collectivists we're holding all the people in New York responsible for that behavior. No, I see when there's criminal activity, you focus your attentions on criminal activity, but you don't contribute to the criminal activity by killing innocents abroad. I think you have to be very, very careful that you hold people personally accountable for their behavior, not whole populations, as the Jews were all held responsible. Oh, by the way, I'd like to remind people too that religious icons, the founders of religions, all depended on migration to survive, fleeing starvation, fleeing drought, fleeing tyrants. They moved around, whether it was Abraham or Joseph or Jesus and Mary or Muhammad, the religious leaders depended on being able to leave behind tyrants. Now, I shudder to think what would have happened to those people if the laws that we have in place were in place in those days and they perished instead. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Iqbal from Indonesia. Your presentation was excellent. My question is, what should we prioritize more? Is it rule of law, regulation, or free trade first? Or you have the list. What is it? What should we prioritize?
On those Economic Freedom of the World Index criteria, well, I think for me, migration would have to be at the top of the list. But of course, all of them are important to combine. You want people, when they're welcome to come, you want to also remove the regulations that allow them to work. You want to not have such high tax barriers that you drive people away. You want entrepreneurs to be able to produce without their property being taken from them and their contracts being secure. So all of them are important, but you can't say, well, we're not going to allow freedom of movement until we get rid of these other problems, because then you make liberty contingent on the officials. They're going to decide whether or not you can have liberty in this area because they've already decided in this area. I would say that the United States has a kind of welfare that has two cronies by protectionism that actually impoverishes many people abroad. A lot of people wouldn't be moving if the United States and Europe and Japan, other rich countries, didn't have the trade barriers up against the things they could produce. The United States contributes a lot to the tyranny abroad by funneling money into the massive war machines in the drug war. End the drug war, and you've eliminated a lot of the fighting and bitterness and black market criminalization that fuels the drive and the desire for people to flee. So these other kinds of behaviors are things that would be very helpful to reduce the motive, the incentive for people to move, because people don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to leave what's familiar to them, except that things get so bad that they have to, as did all the founding fathers who came themselves. Most of the founding fathers that Americans revere highly because they signed the Declaration of Independence would not have been allowed in the United States under these current rules. They would all be considered political radicals. I'm sorry, we can't allow political radicals. Yeah.
Hey Ken, I had a question about your borders argument, because I came to the realization that any argument that can be used against government can equally apply to private property. And what I mean by that is that, let's say I come across some property boundary and I'm fleeing like a tyrant or a murderer or something like that, and I'm here with my family and my kids, and I'm like, hey, let me in, I need to come in, and they say no. This goes back to what David Friedman said about commitment strategies. I'm willing to murder someone if I have to, in order to live and in order for my family to live. And the difference between that and government is that I think people aren't willing to take that step with government. Like, even if it means their death or their family's death, they will not come to that same commitment strategy that they would a normal person.
As a libertarian, I respect your right to protect your own property and your family in the way that you choose fit. But I wouldn't allow you to make that decision for this guy, to say that he's not allowed to use his property. In other words, you can be excluder if you want, and that's fine in any way, shape that you need to. You know, I believe in the right to own guns and protect your own rights. But you shouldn't be able to say that your system is going to be imposed on him so that he can't too.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.